I've completed the first 4 of those inner corners. There, you can see them right there. And they all turned out quite well. I had forgotten to mention in the previous video that the stitch width that I had used on this particular pattern, I just left it at the default of 9 millimeters wide and the stitch length at 5. I did not actually mess with the settings on what the stitch width or the stitch length was. So therefore I cannot answer a question about whether or not I think that that stitch length and stitch width might change if once you hit the lock stitch button, if that's going to also affect how much longer it takes for the machine to create the miter. I don't think that it would make a difference on the stitch width, so on the width being 9 millimeters wide, but I do believe that if you had tampered with the stitch length, which is at 5 millimeters, which is the longest that this particular stitch pattern can be, that it probably would alter that 1/2 inch dimension that I just mentioned. So make sure that if you alter the stitch length on any of these patterns, that you really do check and see how much longer it takes for that miter to be created after you hit the lock stitch button. Okay, but so far on mine, with the stitch width of 9 and the length of 5, it was a 1/2 inch. All right, so I'm going to show you a close-up here of what I created. My stitching is not exactly perfect along this line, but what happened was once the starting point was here, stitched on down to the pivot point right there, locked off, and then I pivoted my fabric and I continued on down. I did try to keep my fabric straight. As you can see, I did pretty well at that, but the dimension is just slightly off of the line that I had previously marked. My fabric does not have any stabilizer in it because I plan to use this as a table runner, and I didn't want any permanent stabilizer on here. So what I did is I starched it very heavily. This is a linen cotton blend that I bought at Joann's fabric store. And what I did with it is I cut about a 20-inch wide piece off of the bolt. I starched it with heavy spray starch, about 4 coats. And I did that very slowly in my fabric preparation. I soaked the fabric quite well with the first layer of starch. I let it dry for about, maybe about 4 to 5 minutes before I pressed it from the back side. And then I sprayed it again. I let it soak in for a good 4 or 5 minutes. And then I turned it over and pressed it again from the opposite side. I do that about 4 times because I wanted this to be quite stiff. You can see if I'm touching my fabric here that you probably can't really tell, but it is quite stiff, and I'm not finding any need so far for additional stabilizer because I've prepped my fabric quite well. All right, so I've got those first 4 inner corners going. I'm going to use the exact same stitch, and I'm next going to stitch it on the inner corner of this. See, I've got like a double line going on here in both directions. I've got, I'm going to have one line here, and then I'm going to have another one going on out here. And they're going to meet up again at the corners. So I'm going to create an inner square. So my next point that I'm going to start at is I'm going to start up at this. No, I'm not. Let's see. Yes, I am, because I want it to be the inner line. So I'm going to start here, and I'm going to sew down to this corner. This is where I'm going to pivot and continue on in that direction. All right, so what I'm planning to do, and I'm not going to stitch a stitch sample of this because I don't have a piece of fabric long enough, and I'm just going to keep my fingers crossed. But what I'm doing is this is going to be my start point. Right here, that's where I'm going to drop my needle down in. This line is going to be riding along what I call the toe of the foot. So let me just pivot my fabric a little bit, and these are the toes of your feet, just like on your real tootsies that you walk on. So this is the toe, and I'm going to line the fabric up, the line that I've drawn on my fabric along this inner toe, somewhat like this. I'm trying to do this with one hand, and so my starting point will be about right there. I'll drop my needle down into that intersection. Okay, hope you can see that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark my fabric down here at the ending point about a 1/2 inch up. And I will get my marker out and I will do that. And I'm going to sew this line, and then I will come back and I'll let you see if that was accurate or not. Okay, be back for part 3.